Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perek He Mishnah Aleph. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov Chana bad Miriam Sason ben Rai Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam beGan Eden Amen and Avdi ben Chaim Lechaim v'derefua shelema Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betoch she'achol Israel and Achlama Mera Binyamin Od Zion Chai ben Dvorah. The first Mishnah of this chapter defines what is biblically forbidden interest and what is rabbinically forbidden interest. Now, just as an introduction to the chapter, the Torah forbids lending money to a fellow Jew and charging him interest on the loan. This means that the lender cannot require the borrower to pay back more than he borrowed. It is similarly forbidden for the borrower to pay or agree to pay interest. And the biblical prohibitions involved in lending on interest are listed in Mishnah 11. Certain other activities that are not actually loans and extra compensations that are not actually interest were forbidden by the rabbis because they resemble lending on interest. Most of the chapter focuses on these rabbinic forms of prohibited interest, and many of these cases discussed in this chapter are quite complicated and involve the types of transactions that were common in the days of the Mishnah, but which are less familiar today. For these reasons and others, Ezeu Neshech, this chapter 5, is known as one of the more difficult chapters in Mishnah. So, Bezrat Hashem Bli Neder, we will again, as usual, use the arts elucidated in the notes to try to understand the Mishnah. So again, beginning with Mishnah Aleph, Perek He Mishnah Aleph, the first Mishnah of this chapter defines what is biblically forbidden interest and what is rabbinically forbidden interest. The Mishnah calls the biblically forbidden interest on a loan neshech, bite, literally means bite, and the rabbinically forbidden interest, talbit, increase. Now the Torah actually refers to biblically forbidden interest as both neshech and talbit in Vayikra chapter 25 verse 36. The Mishnah, however, uses the term talbit, increase, for rabbinically forbidden interest. This is because the rabbinically forbidden interest discussed here increases the lender's wealth without taking a bite out of the borrower's money the way biblically forbidden interest does. The lender's increase comes through a natural rise in prices without taking anything extra from the borrower. The Mishnah gives examples of each type of interest. Ezeu neshech, what type of interest is neshech, which is forbidden by biblical law. Vezeu talbit, and what type of interest is talbit, which is forbidden by rabbinic law. And the Mishnah answers, Ezeu neshech, what is the case of neshech? Hamalveh sela b'chamisha dinarin, someone who lends a seller a coin worth 4 dinars for 5 dinars, meaning on condition that the borrower will pay him 5 dinars in return. Sataim chitin b'shalosh, or he lends 2 se'ah of wheat for 3 se'ah. Both of these arrangements are biblically forbidden and are called neshech, again, bite, b'bneshu noshech, because the lender takes a bite out of the borrower's funds by taking from him more than he gave. Both of these are straightforward loans, one of money and the other of produce. Since they require the borrower to pay back more than he borrowed, they are biblically forbidden. Vezeu talbit, and what is the case of talbit? Hamalbeh beperot, someone who increases his wealth by way of buying produce and receiving more value than he paid for it. If this is done in a way that resembles a loan, it is forbidden by rabbinic law. Now, the reason it's forbidden only rabbinically is not because it involves produce, but because it happens to a sale and not to a loan. Lending produce on interest is biblically forbidden, as we learned in the previous case. Selling produce in a way that resembles a loan is rabbinically forbidden. Ketzad, how so? The Mishnah's illustration involves a complicated transaction made up of 2 separate agreements. The first agreement, Lakach emenu chitin b'dinar zahav akor. For example, someone bought wheat from another person at a price of a gold dinar equal to 25 silver dinars for a kor 30 se'ah of wheat. V'chen hashar, and that was the established price in the market. The term established price implies 2 conditions. Wheat was readily available in the market, and this was the price everyone was charging. The price was a gold dinar for a kor, which is a gold dinar for 30 se'ah of wheat. The buyer paid for the wheat in advance with understanding that the seller would give him the wheat during the course of the year as needed. This was permissible because wheat at this price is readily available in the market. The buyer did not want to take the wheat now and store it throughout the year. He therefore made an agreement with the dealer that he would hold the wheat and deliver it to the buyer as needed during the course of the year. The buyer paid for a certain amount of wheat at the rate of a gold dinar for 30 se'ah of wheat, and he paid all the money in advance. Ordinarily, it is forbidden to pay in advance for goods that will not be delivered until a later date. The rabbis prohibited this because the price of the goods might rise before they are delivered, and the buyer would then receive more value than he paid for in exchange for letting the seller have the money in advance. Now, this resembles interest being paid on a loan. The money paid in advance is like a loan, since the buyer does not receive anything for it until some later date, and delivering the goods to him later on is repaying the loan. Since later the goods are worth more than the money that was given in advance, it resembles repaying the loan with interest. However, the rabbis permitted paying in advance in a case where the seller has the goods in his possession when the buyer pays him. Since the buyer could take them now, the money he pays in advance is not viewed as a loan but as a pure sale, even though the goods do not actually become his until they are delivered. The rabbis extended this leniency even further. Even if the seller does not yet have the goods, but he could easily buy them for this price in the market with the money he now gets from the buyer, he is permitted to take the buyer's money in advance. Since the seller could easily buy the goods, we view him as already having them, and since he has them, we view his contract with the buyer as a sale rather than a loan. And this is why the Mishnah says that a gold dinar for a kol was the market price. It means to teach that even if the seller did not yet have the wheat in his possession, the contract for the wheat was permitted, since this was the established market price for wheat at that time. Amdu chitin b'shloshim dinarin. In the meantime, the price of wheat increased, and it stands at 30 silver dinars per kol. Even so, if the buyer were to take delivery of the wheat now, there would be no problem of interest, because he is viewed as having taken possession of the wheat from the time he paid for it. Since the seller could have bought the wheat in the market immediately, we consider it as if he had the wheat in his possession at the time of the sale. Therefore, when the buyer paid him in advance, we view him as having acquired the wheat at that time. The buyer, of course, did not really acquire anything at that time, and we're viewing him as acquiring it is only in regard to the prohibition of taking interest on a loan, since on the biblical level, the prohibition of taking interest is only on a real loan, not on a sale, and it is the rabbis who prohibited doing so with sales that resemble loans. They were lenient in cases where the transaction appears less like a loan and more like a sale. So wherever we can view the buyer as having acquired the merchandise before the price went up, the rabbis allowed the transaction. Therefore, it was his wheat that went up in value. However, now that the price of wheat has gone up, the buyer decides that he wants to sell the wheat and buy something else. This leads to a second agreement, which is problematic. Amarlo, the buyer now says to the seller, "Ten li chitai, give me my wheat, shani rotzeh lemochran v'likach ben yain, because I want to sell it and buy wine with the money I get for it." Amarlo, the seller says to the buyer, "Harei chitecha siot alai b'shoshim dinarin." Instead of taking the wheat and selling it to buy wine, let your wheat that I owe you be considered a debt of 30 dinars upon me, and you will now have a right to receive from me wine with the amount I now owe you for the wheat. In other words, the seller tells the buyer that since he no longer wants wheat but wine, he will buy the wheat back from him at its current market price of 30 dinars. This is permissible, since the buyer would be permitted to take the wheat if he still wanted it. He is also permitted to take its value in money. However, instead of giving him the money, the seller will owe him the money and pay off that obligation at a later date by supplying the buyer with wine worth 30 dinars. However, the seller does not have any wine right now. He is also not receiving any new money from the buyer with which to buy wine. The money he received from the buyer when they made a deal for wheat has now become a debt owed by the seller to the buyer. The buyer is contracting for wine in exchange for giving a debt, not for cash. Even this would be permitted if the seller had wine in his possession when he made the second deal, since we could then view the buyer as acquiring the wine immediately in return for forgiving the debt. The problem arises because the seller does not have any wine at this time, and the buyer is getting only an obligation of wine for what is owed to him. Therefore, even if wine is available in the market at an established price, the seller cannot be considered to have wine in his possession. Since the seller does not have wine, the buyer cannot be viewed as acquiring wine from him at this time. It was only earlier with regard to the wheat that the buyer was viewed as acquiring ownership of it as soon as he paid, because he gave money that the seller could have used to buy wheat at that time. Here, though the buyer is not giving him the money for the wine, he is merely agreeing to accept it as payment for the money he is owed. Therefore, if the price of wine goes up between the time they make the new agreement and the time the wine is delivered, the buyer will be receiving from the seller something that is worth more than what he was owed. The arrangement is therefore rabbinically forbidden. In summary, we have learned 3 rules in this Mishnah regarding rabbinically prohibited interest that takes place through sales. A. It is forbidden for a person to pay in advance for goods he will not receive until some later time, because the money paid in advance is viewed as a loan. Therefore, if the price of the goods rises before they are delivered, the buyer will be receiving something worth more than the loan he gave when he paid in advance. B. However, if the seller actually has the goods in his possession at the time the deal is made, it is permitted to pay him in advance, even though the goods will not be delivered until a later time. And C. Even if the seller does not yet have the goods when he makes the deal with the buyer, but they are available in the market at that time at an established price, it is permissible to pay in advance if the buyer pays in cash. If he is merely forgiving a debt or a loan in return, it is forbidden. And that is out of Mishnah Aleph. Mishnah Bet gives further examples of rabbinically forbidden interest. The first example involves a loan. Hamalved chavero, someone who gives a loan to his friend. Lo yadu bechatzro chinam, should not live in the borrower's courtyard for free without paying rent, meaning he should not live in a house belonging to the borrower for free without paying rent. V'lo yiskol mimenu b'pachot, nor may he rent it from him for less than the usual rate. Mipnei shu ribit, because it is rabbinically forbidden interest. Allowing the lender to live in a house for free or for less than the going rate is a gift to the lender. Since the borrower gives him this in addition to repaying the loan, it is forbidden interest. However, since the loan was not made on condition that the borrower would give this benefit to the lender, it is forbidden only by rabbinic law. Only interest that is made part of the original loan agreement is biblically forbidden. The Mishnah now introduces a new type of rabbinically forbidden interest, charging a higher price for a sale or lease in exchange for waiting for the full payment. In the cases that follow, the buyer or renter acquires the rights to the property as soon as the deal is concluded, even if he does not pay for everything at that time. His ownership of these rights does not depend on completing the payment. Rather, the money he has not yet paid is simply a debt he owes to the seller or landlord of the property. Marbin al sachar, it is permissible to increase the amount of rent a person charges someone who does not pay in advance. Ve'en marbin al mecher, but it is not permissible to increase the price a person charges for a sale to a buyer who does not pay up front at the time of the purchase. Ketzad, the Mishnah illustrates these rules. How so? If someone rents his courtyard to another person, v'amarlo, and says to him, if you give me the rent for the entire year now, it is yours for 10 selah for the year. But if you pay me for it month by month, then I give it to you for a selah per month, which is 12 selah for the year. Mutar, it is permitted. Since rent is really due at the end of each month, the true price is 12 selah, and the landlord's offer of 10 selah for the year is a discount for getting paid in advance rather than a charge for waiting to get paid. Machalo sadeo, however, if someone sells his field to another person, v'amarlo, and he says to him, if you give me the money for the field now, it is yours for 1,000 zuz. Im lagoren, but if you want to delay paying me until the threshing time, when the grain from the field can be sold so you can raise money to pay me, then it is yours for 12 maneh, 1,200 zuz. Asur, it is forbidden. Since money for a sale is due as soon as the sale takes effect, the true price for the field is 1,000 zuz, and the demand for 1,200 zuz is a charge for waiting to get paid. This is rabbinically forbidden interest. Since the buyer now owes the seller money for the item he bought, he in effect borrowed the purchase price 1,000 zuz from him. Since he later pays him 1,200 zuz, he has paid interest on this loan. In short, when two prices are presented, the true price is considered to be the one that applies when the money is legally due. If that is the lower price, and the higher price is considered an extra charge for waiting to be paid, this is considered to be like interest on a loan and is rabbinically forbidden. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.